students to this lecture on understanding the rubric project. The rubric project is worth 15% of your grade and it is due on Sunday, July 28th. Everything I'm about to show you is, as always, located in the assignments folder under the rubric project folder. You'll see the instructions and template that we're going to work through. You'll see the grading rubric and you'll see the link to submit. The first thing you're going to do for your rubric project is to look at the template and instructions in the assignment folder and simply work through the items. The first item asks you to select one standard, just one, not more than one, to develop a rubric for. So this is an assignment that, think about it as if you're teaching this standard and you have to do a project with the students. That's a performance task. And then you're going to assess it with a rubric. Don't select more than one standard for this assignment or it gets too complicated. You're going to write the assignment in its entirety, not just its number, but write out the entire standard where it says standard. It's important to note before we go on that you may use the same standard and learning target that you've used for assignments before in the class. After you have your standard, you're going to think about thinking about and develop a learning target that's aligned with that standard. So remember what that means. Your learning target is a little piece of the standard. It's not the entire standard. It's got to be measurable and it's got to have a criterion for success. So a lot of times you get objectives and learning targets confused, and you'll see my feedback that says this is an objective, not a learning target. Remember that a learning target has a criterion, such as with 80% accuracy or 4 out of 5. So remember to include that. Next, you'll think about the context of where your lesson will be taught. So what grade level will this be taught on? Is it a regular classroom or a special ed or a gifted classroom? How many students are there? Describe the students, what topics have been taught so far, and what might come next. This is just to give the reader a general sense of the overall lesson that's going to be used to teach this particular learning target. And then in a paragraph or two, describe the lesson. So this doesn't have to be in a lot of detail, but it should be, again, something that's aligned with your standard and learning target and that can be assessed through a performance task. So number 5 is an important step. Think of a performance task the students might do to demonstrate they have mastered the learning target. Remember that a performance task is something students do as opposed to something that they know. It is not measured with a multiple choice, true, false. Examples of performance tasks include writing essays, developing PowerPoints, writing poetry, solving math problems, and more. They must perform. And so then you're going to describe the performance task. So let's say you've taught a unit, you're teaching a unit on American history and colonial America, and you have 5th grade students, and you want them to demonstrate their knowledge. Then after they could design maybe a PowerPoint, and that's a performance task. It's not something that's just about knowledge. They have to perform and do something with that knowledge. So that is going to be the performance task in that example. The last thing you have to do is to select a rubric. So you should select the type of rubric that you will use to score the task. It can be a holistic or an analytic rubric, but you should think about the justifications because you're going to have to write about that next. Your textbook has some really good justifications about when you could use either type of rubric. Develop the rubric. I find it's easiest to develop rubrics by inserting word tables and using the rows and columns rather than trying to space out, because if you do it without a table, your spacing is going to be off and it's going to be very difficult to read, and I might have to send it back and ask you to reformat it. Your rubric should be well suited to the task and grade level. So It should be something that students can understand at their grade level, or you can explain it to them. The criteria and levels of performance are appropriate and clear. So again, just like we're doing in the assignments this week and next, you need to think about what would be the best example of that assignment. So if it's the PowerPoint, for example, what would the best PowerPoint have in it? And you make a list of those things. So you might say, for example, good PowerPoints have fonts that are readable. Good PowerPoints have um, engaging, lively pictures. So you make a list of all the criteria that go into a good assignment and then decide on your levels of performance. So are you going to have 3 or 4 or 5? What are you going to call those levels? Are you going to call them good, excellent, for example? And then you have to make sure that you describe each level in the cell of the table. Many good examples are in your textbook. Criteria that are well aligned with objectives and standards. Descriptions of criteria are teachable, clear, identifiable, and measurable. The continuum between levels of performance are clear and appropriate. And the rubric is well aligned with the task. So you're going to put your rubric there. Finally, you're going to write a justification to support your choice for the rubric. State whether your rubric is analytic or holistic, and why you chose this type of rubric. Use the textbook and/or other readings to support your reasoning. You must select one or more arguments using the textbook and cite the textbook appropriately to receive full credit. So if I don't see a citation from the textbook, you won't get full credit on this section. In addition to the instruction and template, you'll find the grading rubric for this assignment in the assignment folder. And I'd like to take you through that grading rubric now so you'll see how your assignment will be graded. I often encourage students to print out or have the rubric nearby as they're writing their assignment so they can see the target that they need to hit. So first of all, I'm going to look to see if your standard is there, if it's written out in its entirety. Next, I'll look at your learning target, and I'm going to be looking at certain things. So is it clear? Is it measurable? Does it have a criterion, excuse me, for success? Is it aligned to the standard? I'm going to be looking at your context to see if I can really understand how the lesson relates to the learning target and standard. Is it thoroughly described? I'm going to be looking at the description of the lesson, and I'm going to be looking at your performance task. So in other words, does this lesson and does this task lend itself to a performance task? Remember what I mean by that. Shouldn't be a simple right, no assessment, shouldn't be multiple choice or true, false. It should be something that's really complex enough to have to grade with a rubric. In terms of your rubric, I'm going to be looking at the criteria, that is the rows of the rubric. And are they called out well? The levels of performance. Do you have just 2 levels? You really shouldn't. You should have 3 to 5 levels. So you might label one level, for example, developing, and another fair. Look in your textbook for other, and let's re-listen to the lecture for other suggested levels that you could call them. Your rubric, I call it the teacher rubric because there is such a thing as a student rubric. But the rubric you're doing for this task should be aligned to what you're asking the students to do. So if you're asking students to make a poster, for example, you shouldn't have a rubric that calls out criteria such as doing math or focuses on their reading or writing ability too much. We've talked about that a little bit in the lectures. Your justification, I'm going to look to see if you justified using an analytic or holistic rubric. And here's an important concept. You have to go back to your textbook and support your ideas with citations from the textbook. If you don't do that, you won't get full credit on this particular assignment. I'm going to look at your overall spelling, grammar, and professionalism. Do you write in a professional way? Do you have a lot of spelling mistakes or grammatical errors? And finally, I'm going to look at your rubric presentation. And by that, what I mean is it in a table? Is it lined up properly and formatted properly? Sometimes I get assignments where um, you don't put the rubric in a table and all of a sudden everything's out of alignment. So that's how this will be graded. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.